Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending today's presentation, Before the Breach, Cybersecurity for Law Firms and Clients. A few housekeeping details we have to go through. We want you all to know you will receive your MCLE certificates shortly after the program. Your certificate will also be stored in the BHBA Plus section, our members only community. Please take a moment to complete the survey that is included with your certificate. With that being said, I'd like to get started. We have three very esteemed presenters today, Heather Antoine, Diana Iketani, and Tim O'Brien. So we're going to turn it over to you guys now. And also the Q&A section of the chat, not chat, but the presentation is open for any questions you might have. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Heather. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So we're going to kind of just dive in here because we have so much to talk about in this hour, and we really want to make sure we cover it. But if you have need any information about our bios or anything like that, I'm sure it's tagged somewhere, and feel free to reach out to us. So we'll be here, but otherwise we're just going to jump right in. And my job here in the beginning of this is to scare you all. So I'm going to give you a few data breach stories from the last 2 years. So these are very recent. And then I'm also just going to give you some statistics on law firms and data breaches. So first, some of you may have heard about several very large scale data breaches that occurred recently. The one was using an employee's stolen credentials. And by using those credentials, bad actors in New York City infiltrated the law department network there. The department employed thousands of people and holds all of their sensitive data, including evidence of police misconduct. And they were infiltrated, and that information was taken away. They, funny enough, failed to roll out multi-factor authentication, which would have prevented this from happening, but that was a very big breach that occurred in 2020. Also in 2020, the firm of Grubman Shire was the target of a cyber attack, which resulted in 756 gigabytes of stolen PII, that's personally identifiable information. The ransomware bad actors initially demanded $21 million, then doubled it to $42 million, and eventually doubled that again. And throughout the doubling process, they kept releasing more information as a threat. So initially it was 2 gigabytes of Lady Gaga's contracts. Then, they moved on to Trump's personal data, and no one ever paid. And this information is out in the ether right now, actually for sale, if you wanted to buy it on the dark web. And there's so many other incidents like this, especially now in 2020 and 2021, where people were working from home, and we'll kind of get into how that affected things later. So the ABA in October found that 29% of law firms reported a security breach, with more than 1 in 5 saying they weren't sure if there was ever a breach, and 36 reporting malware infections. There has been a 900% increase in cyber-related cases in the past decade. The median financial loss is over $1 million per case. So we are not talking small numbers here. When you put that together, in only 2021, you're looking at $6 trillion, which is massive, massive, massive. And professional firms are experiencing increasing rates of cyber attacks over anyone else, because we often do not have as great of security, but we have all of our client information, and that's what makes us the target. And so kind of keep all of that in the back of your mind as we move forward through this, because these are real threats, and it's really important that we are cautious and do what we're supposed to do here. So with that, I think I've sufficiently scared you all, and I'll pass the mic to Diana.
Heather, I think you did a great a job of scaring people, but it is frightening. I'm Diana Iketani Iorlano. I'm the principal of Iketani Law in El Segundo, and I'm a data security and privacy lawyer. So I wanted to thank this amazing panel. We had some time to chat about these very, very, very timely topics in the last couple of days. And what we're seeing is just a variety of attacks. There are attacks that you've heard of, and there's always new technology. So there's going to be different types of attacks that you haven't heard of yet. Obviously, many of them go from just the physical aspects, right? People are working from home. Somebody leaves a laptop in a car, and somebody gets access to that. We often forget about the physical security of our items or password protected phones. If it's not an adequate password, there's a lot of our law firm data that's available on those mobile devices. And then you have things like viruses and hackers that are actually hacking into systems to get this information. Phishing attempts, which you've seen in those emails that say you've won some prize, or even an email that's spoofing somebody's address inside your company that says it's the boss and I need all of those W-2s, tomorrow. Send them to me at this address, or upload them here. Ransomware is absolutely rampant. The DOJ estimates that 75% of the ransomware attacks are in small businesses. So, it's not just big business that's being hit. A 2020 survey showed that 47% of the ransomware incidents were in businesses between 100 and 1,000 people, and 54% were in 1,000 to 5,000 employee companies. So, we're talking about half of these companies being hit with ransomware. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's gotten through, but there've been these attempts, and it's happening all the time. So especially with remote work, one of the things that we'll talk about later is ways to kind of think about proactively addressing that. But I think I'll throw it over to Tim, because we think of law firms as maybe sometimes we think, why would we be targets? But Tim, what's the why and the who of this? Who are the targets?
Thank you, Diana. Awesome intro to both you and Heather. Let me first say my background a bit so you understand my perspective. I'm the Director of Cyber and Security for MMA West, but I also sit on the National Cyber Center of Excellence. My background is all IT. I'm a former IT Director and CIO, but also spent 17 years in Europe working for US Air Forces Europe, NATO, and Allied Forces Northern Europe, and US Stratcom. So I have done just about every IT role out there. I have left the data center. I work on the insurance side now. So to your point, Diana, all of you are high value targets, not just from the insurer's perspective, but from those bad actors out there. You represent Hollywood. You're Los Angeles. They know you worldwide. This is not Kansas. Wizard of Oz notwithstanding. Nobody knows about them as like they do you. So in the entertainment side, the M&A side, litigation, they love that because of the high value of the data you own and the clients you represent. You are a gold mine or a crypto mine, because this is all done in crypto. They love targets such as yourself. Extortion, think ransomware, but it gets better. You and your clients have a lot of IP and confidential information. They love to exfiltrate that and use it as a competitive advantage if they don't use it as well in the ransomware event. But it can get worse, and the trend line is changing. We see in Ukraine a very kinetic battle, but we are in a virtual battle on the cyber side. Destruction of data and/or systems is more of a common occurrence simply because of the threats that we face. So I'll simply state, finishing up on this topic, who is doing it? Individuals, affiliated groups, Cozy Bear is just one fun name they go by, nation states, as well as insiders. People often forget the insiders who may work in collaboration with any of those three. So just be aware you are a high value target at all times.
Awesome. So we're going to get going into the actual practical tips, hopefully, that we can provide during this session. And we've broken it up into several pieces, kind of like the timeline of a breach. So first, we're going to start with pre-breach, then we're going to talk about the breach, and then we're going to talk about the post-breach. And so with the pre-breach, obviously we've all heard a million cliches about this, but what is it? A pound of prevention is, or an ounce of prevention is, you guys get it. So insert the cliche here, you must prepare is the moral of the story. Prepare, prepare, prepare. You have to get your ducks in a row. And those ducks include having a security audit and a data map, so you know where everything lives and you know where the vulnerabilities in your system lie. Without those two things, you have already set yourself up for failure. When you put those two things in place, you're really setting yourself up for potentially preventing a lot of very preventable issues. Part of the security plan is an incident response plan. There's also a written information security program. Those two documents go hand in hand. So for an incident response plan, this is really important, because what it is basically it tells you all of the activities that are required in each phase of an incident response. So should a breach occur, who is responsible for what? What are the responsible duties we have to complete for each activity? What are the communication pathways? So let's say that a breach occurs. Who's getting called? Who finds out about it? How are we notifying people of these issues? And most law firms, frankly, are ill prepared for responding to a data breach. Only 36% of law firms currently report that they have an incident response plan. That number goes up as the law firm size increase. So 80% of law firms with 100 plus attorneys report that they have an incident response plan. And that makes sense. But ideally, I'm sure we can all say this on this panel, that we would love it if everyone had an incident response plan, because you really, really need it. And
Heather, just to jump in there, I mean, I think it's because it's an incident response, right? It can just be something you suspect could be a breach, where you don't actually have confirmation that somebody got in, but you've gotten a spammy email and it's regenerating. So it's about incidents, not just breaches. So it is about that preparation. Sorry to jump in there.
Yes, no, perfect. I'm glad you jumped in on that. And it's a really good point, because I think the plan itself, I pulled up our plan just before this, just to see what we wrote in there. And there are certain times things are not going to get flagged to me, right? As inside privacy counsel for our firm and outside counsel for many clients, I'm on a lot of incident response plans, but sometimes if it's just a spammy email, like Diana said, it's going to go to the appropriate people in the IT department, figure out it didn't get anywhere, and it's just an incident, we close it, we record it. But it's so important that you have this plan so that everybody knows what they're doing. The incident response team knows who they are. So that's the what and the who. And the where is, it should be accessible physically, which is something a lot of people forget. If your system goes down and you don't have access to the incident response plan, you're in trouble. So it should physically be somewhere or on a different server or, multiple places. Templates exist. There are a million of them out there. Please, if you're going to use a template, revise it, make it your own. We're all lawyers. We all can use templates, but let's be responsible about it. And then the written information security program is a little different, but goes hand in hand. And what it does is it details like security controls you have. What are your policies? What is the roadmap for IT in your company, in your law firm? And this is a document that's required by several states. So without fail, if you have a breach that's reported to Massachusetts, for example, they will write you a letter and say, we want a copy of your WISP. And you better have one. So, that's a very important document as well. And I would be remiss without saying two other things. One, you need trainings. security trainings are required by multiple state laws. And you have to be able to tell people, at your law firm, who are touching data, what their access rights are, and what to do if someone makes a request for that data. And if a situation occurs, what are we doing? And then the second thing that I want to say, and I want to kind of close out the breach part for myself, is you have to test everything. If you don't practice, you're going to show up on the field on game day and not know what's happening. And it just makes everything so much worse. So as if you run an earthquake drill or a fire drill, which we all don't like, you have to test all of these plants to make sure they're working. Diana, what are some technical steps that people can take?
Yeah, I think what you just mentioned is a great segue in looking at the levels of access. Who needs to have access to certain information within the firm or certain client information? Because, we've seen those breaches at a hospital where, some celebrities' medical records have gotten out. And then the question becomes, who had access to that information? So what we want to look at is access controls, making sure that not everybody in the firm has access to all of those sensitive client documents or even HR documents. Who really needs to know it? And can you set levels of access and lock people out of certain things so that it's not as much of a target? But separately, really considering the data that you collect and what it's used for and whether you still need it. There's a theory of data minimization, minimizing the amount of data that you have under your control, the personal data, right? That's what we're talking about here. So you don't get hit for a breach of information that you don't have. So you should think about whether, for instance, I worked at a firm when I first got out of law school that collected the driver's license of every client, a photograph or a photocopy of the driver's license. And it was to identify them, but it wasn't really something we used after that initial intake to make sure that it was a bankruptcy firm, so to make sure that we had the right people. So do you keep that information into perpetuity, or do you shred it? Do you delete it? Do you do something with that information? So things to think about are, what are the pieces of data that you're bringing in? And Heather already talked about data mapping. Where do those pieces of information come from? Where do they go to? Are you collecting information on a web form? And if so, is it secure? And then where does it go? Does it populate your client relationship management software? Do you use it to generate, documents to your clients because you're using those fields? There's a lot of different applications that can be used right now to simplify our lives, but some of them haven't been vetted for that security component. So you're really going to want to educate yourselves on what kinds of software you're using, what are the locations that your data is stored in, is it encrypted? Obviously, encryption is a huge factor, especially for personal information. Extracting and exfiltrating encrypted data is not as damaging as unencrypted data. So you really have to think about whether you can use levels of encryption or whether certain documents need to be locked and passworded and how to implement that. A lot of times lawyers get caught up in the day-to-day and say, it's just going to take too long. I'm not going to do that. But really consider that for sensitive information, but also just information that, you might have a document that has everyone in the firm's passwords in it, maybe, So things like that are things that you're really going to want to think about protecting. Changing passwords and having those password management types of things. If you have a single sign-on for your, enterprise-wide stuff, how often are you forcing your employees or yourself to change those passwords? I use a password manager in my everyday life. I actually don't know most of my passwords now. Very scary, but you've got to embrace sort of this idea that password manager is also telling me when my passwords have been exposed in a breach. It's telling me to change them. It's telling me if I use repetitive passwords on multiple websites. So those are things that you can implement into your personal life right now, as well as your firm life. And just physical controls. Who has access to your servers? Who has access to your cloud? A lot of us have interfaces with clients who need to access documents. Are those specific invitations only to the client, or is it a link? When you use Google Docs, you make something very easy, but sometimes anybody who has that link can get into that document. and you have no control over who forwards that link to somebody else. So really think about the technology that we're using and how to implement some of these controls. Like we talked about earlier too, with devices, everyone's remote, everyone's working, and using, a phone, a mobile phone, and an iPad and a laptop to access these things. Do they have adequate controls on all those devices? Do you require it as part of the law firm's protocol that, everyone has to have some sort of way that I can wipe that data from your phone? People hate that. Employees hate that. When you say, hey, I need to have access to your phone, because if you lose it, I want to wipe that data off your phone. So consider that and consider how you can do that. And if it's in your policy, then that's just what it is. If somebody wants to use the phone to access their work email, then that's a reasonable request. So I think that's, some of the technical considerations that you can make in this sort of pre-breach, before anything has happened phase. And I'm going to throw it over to Tim to kind of talk about other things that we can do in that pre-breach phase from the insurance side and otherwise.
Absolutely. And let me say up front, from an IT perspective, all this information you hear, the organizations who are successful employ these. I work with firms who have breaches from an IT side. I see it all the time. They are missing these best practices. This takeaway could not be better. So more power to everyone who does this. I will say not all cyber policies are equal. Cyber is the new kid on the insurance block. There are no standard forms. There are no standard applications. Broker expertise is invaluable. But the basics, what should be in any cyber policy? First party coverage, third party coverage, e-crime. First party will cover the cyber extortion, ransomware, incident investigation costs, reputation-based income loss, business interruption, data restoration. So absolutely essential. Not all policies have those in there. Another one is contingent business interruption. Do you rely on an MSP? Do you store your data in the cloud? That is under contingent business interruption. Is that in your policy? Third party, media liability, big for the entertainment industry, but anyone with a social media presence. Fines, penalties, all that under third party. Privacy and security liability as well under there. E-crime, invoice manipulation, funds transfer fraud, social engineering fraud. Those are usually lower dollar limit, 100,000, 50,000, 200,000-ish. Ransomware, as we heard earlier, 2 million, 10 million, 40 million, 100 million in some high value cases. Your broker is invaluable. Ensure that your policy is fully comprehensive for what you do.
Yeah, I think that's just so important because so many people end up with policies at the end of the day that don't cover them. And then it's too late, right? Now something's happened and we're trying to use that policy and we realize it's not, and now it's all coming out of pocket. And so, or maybe not all of it, but half of it comes out of pocket, and this stuff gets expensive, which I think is a good segue into a breach. So let's say a breach occurs, worst case scenario here. You have done everything appropriately. You have an incident response plan. Wonderful. Let's go get it. Convene your incident response team. If there's a breach or a suspected breach, I always say allow the lawyer to quarterback. And there's multiple reasons for that. There are going to be a lot of people on your incident response team. And let's say like the C-suite, your head of IT, people like that are going to want to be on the team. You want to keep your lawyer kind of the one who's running the show, sending out all the emails, although sometimes you may not want to send emails, but the one contacting everybody, because arguably then you're keeping everything under privilege, which is so important. And the lawyer who's experienced in this can lead the question surrounding, you know, directing people. I wouldn't say surrounding whether a breach occurred, because most lawyers can't do that piece, but directing people into where they need to go. And so there's several steps to this. The first step is, you know, verify if a breach occurred. What systems do we think were affected? What data is contained in those systems? What type of breach was it? So on and so forth. Contain and then mitigate. So you may want to have a forensics team take the machines offline or segregate certain systems. And this is where the incident response plan is really important. That incident response plan should list who your forensics team is. You don't want to find a forensics team the day of a breach. That person should already exist, and you should tell them that they're your person, so they're ready for it, or a company. Same with PR. The third thing you're going to want to do is investigate and analyze the breach. So preserve any data that needs to be preserved. If something is super sensitive, communicate by telephone. You know, sometimes you want things in email. You know, there's a lot of figuring out the breach during the breach piece that's very, very important. And simultaneously,
Heather, I have a quick question. You know, people do sort of throw around the phrase breach pretty freely, but for us, I think it's a matter of semantics of when somebody's saying, oh my gosh, we've had a breach, and they email everybody on the incident response plan. Do you have any best practices for that?
Yeah, so that's why I also think it's really good idea to bring your lawyer in, bring your lawyer to work, because at that, you know, it may not be a breach. And that was actually the next point that I was going to make, which is analyze the legal implications, because the term breach is defined differently by every state, which is really wild to think about. So all 50 states, the District of Columbia, every US territory has a different data breach statute. And so a lot of the times we end up playing this puzzle piece where we figure out maybe it wasn't a breach in New Mexico, but it was a breach in Hawaii. And so we have to, you know, determine, is it a breach, is it not a breach? And sometimes it's not a breach, but people think it is. And generally speaking, I'll tell you what, and there are outliers, but generally you're going to need, for it to be considered a breach, a last name plus a social security number, a driver's license number, a passport number, or a tax ID number. It could be a financial account or credit card or debit card in combination with a security code or access code or password, health insurance information, and then a username or email address in combination with the password or a security question. So there's pieces to this that go together that often people don't realize. So if they have a breach and it's people's last names, first names, and email address, it may not actually be considered a breach, right? And so that's where having the right people on your team and maybe not jumping the gun is really important, but also make sure you have the right people on your team who know when to jump the gun, because you have to sometimes notify authorities very quickly. So in the EU and UK, it's within 72 hours. And you have to have a communications plan to do all of that. And it gets really, if you haven't practiced, practice makes perfect. If you haven't practiced, this can all be very overwhelming at the time of a breach. If you have practice, then the people know what they're supposed to do, when they're supposed to do it. Everyone just acts the way they need to act to get to the next point, which can be notifying authorities. It could be notifying individuals if there is actually a breach. And the last point I want to make on this before I kind of pass it over to Tim and Diana is to say the cost of notifying individuals is massive. It's massive because your legal costs in figuring out who have to be notified are quite large. And then the physical costs of sending out mailers, in addition to providing people with like LifeLock or some sort of some sort of protection that may be required by statute, it adds up very quickly. And Tim, I think that's like a good segue to you, which is a breach occurs and you tender it to insurance, right? What happens?
That's right. And I'll tag on a bit about IR plans. I, as an IT professional, have crafted them, supported crafting them, and offer our clients guidance on them. They're not that hard to do. Simple. An IR plan. Account for each of the first party issues in your policy that your policy covers. Those are the events that you should have a process for in your IR plan, plus e-crime. Now, as far as coverage goes, if you have an IR plan, be sure to test it. It is a two-step process in event of a breach. You're going to do two things. One, contact the insurer following the details of the policy. They will invariably engage an attorney. Why? Attorney-client privilege. Starts right from the top. Second, you will want to contact your broker. At MMA, for example, we have a stellar claims handling team that works alongside with the insurer collaboratively to take care of our insureds. But once you contact the insurer, they will assign a breach coach, usually counsel. Forensics and everything else follows after that. I can tell you that even with the best prepared firms, it will take some time to recover. But if you don't have those best practices in place, and I know I've said it before, you do yourself a disservice. Be prepared. Test that IR plan. Follow the two guidelines. Contact the insurer according to policy requirements and your broker. You'll be in a much better place doing that. They'll help you through it. That's what they're designed to do.
Great tips, great tips. Do either of you have anything else on breach, things to do during the breach? Because if not, we'll move into sort of post-breach. What can we expect after that? So
Sure.
I'll transition into the post-breach world. So you suffered a breach. You have to have thought about some of these things in advance. How do you actually function the next day if you can't access any of your client documents? What's the public relations nightmare that you have to deal with if you now have to tell, or frankly, if someone else out there who has your information tells the rest of the world that they have all of your files and they're locked up until you give them $5 million in crypto? The whole post-breach world moves very quickly. It will be an all hands on deck event. Your CEO, your managing partner, all those people are going to need to stop what they're doing to deal with this. So you've got to be able to explain what happened as best that you can. The other thing is that, what Heather talked about engaging outside counsel and engaging your forensics team and things like that, you have to realize that if you've suffered a breach, it may not be the best protocol for you to ask your IT department what happened, because clearly it may have been a failure of one of their policies or procedures. So having a third party come in to investigate that is really, really important to get to the bottom of it. If you're still telling, your IT team is telling you, hey, I'm going to get it fixed. I know how to fix it. Don't worry, we'll get it back up online in 24 hours. You've really got to do some hard looking at the company and what you've done in the past, and really consult some outside experts there, because it can be an ongoing breach, right? You can stop it, or it may be there worming its way through your system, collecting things and exfiltrating them. So it doesn't just end once you've reported it. There is no magic stop button there. Heather, did you have some things?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in addition to it doesn't end when you report it, it didn't start when you found it. It generally started months before that, if not years before that on average. And so the lifespan is much, I think, longer than we think it is.
Absolutely right. I've
Absolutely.
seen these personally. They're often in there for at least months ahead of time, especially for high value targets. Be aware of that. And you don't want your IT team touching the systems before forensics has had a chance to review what happened. To Diana's point, IT may have failed with a process or a best practice. They need to know that. What was the vector of attack? Forensics will show that.
Yep. So, and then after you may still be in the process of evaluating what happened, and then the litigation comes in, or the AG says, hey, what's going on? So what you're then facing is the potential for, and under the CCPA, you've got the potential for consumer class actions related to a breach, but you also have enforcement actions. You also have to look at whether law enforcement is going to do something here, or if you have a breach of social security numbers, have you notified the IRS for all of your clients that now may have people filing things erroneously or fraudulently under their social security number or under their name? So there's a lot of moving parts there. And it's not just litigation for, you know, I had a breach and I'm going to resolve that because you gave me credit monitoring. The stakes are very high under the CCPA and the CPRA. So you're looking at millions and millions of dollars, which may be beyond your insurance limits. So it's really something to think about. The litigation too may not just be breach related. It may be unfair competition, 17200 claims, unfair business practices, types of derivative claims based on the breach of the statute, even in states that don't have a data breach statute that allows consumers to sue. Plaintiffs' attorneys have been very clever about finding ways to make that suit under unfair competition or unfair business practices. There's going to be a whole list of folks that you're going to need to notify from the end users, your clients, who you may have to tell now, hey, we had a breach. Here's how it affects you. Here's how it doesn't. And maybe a mass email isn't the best way to convey that to folks. So you might really want to think, you know, if my biggest client had this problem and I've got to tell them, what's the best way for me to do that? You know, do you engage a PR team? The answer would be yes. But also, you know, nobody wants to get that call, but very few people want to just get the email that says, oh, by the way, this happened and we're working on it. We don't know exactly what happened, but we'll fix it and we'll make it up to you. So even consider who you need to call. The other element that I don't think we touched on is the fact that some of your contracts with other parties may require you to notify them. So if you have certain types of agreements where you're sharing information or you are now in possession of one of your clients' information, then the clients may have to notify their customers of the breach that you had. So you also have to have that as part of your incident response plan and your communication in the event of a breach. What contracts have these provisions in it that require me to notify somebody? If you're dealing with international deals and you've got data subjects in the EU or the UK, most of those contracts will have a data processing addendum, a data processing agreement that dictates when you need to notify of a breach. So there's also, you know, we're law firms. We may have hundreds of thousands of contracts that may be implicated. And again, how are you going to notify all of those people? So it's going to be an ongoing obligation, but also you've got to make sure that you have the right team in place to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So, you know, how are you going to store the data? Are there redundancies that can help you get back up and operational if you're dealing with ransom? You know, is litigation covered under your insurance? Is it, you know, is there indemnification that might apply where you have another party that you can call on to share that obligation, to share that expense? So lots of things to think about post-breach. Tim, Heather, you guys have other thoughts?
Absolutely. And, you know, just to the litigation point, included in policy terms, but every aspect of an incident. So view the sum of your policy, your cyber policy, as what is covered from an incident as a whole. Incidents are the first party, third party e-crime. Now, some of that may be taking place as a result of a hack into your network, of a ransomware event. Some of those items may not be involved, but the cost of an incident overall is what is covered by the policy limit. And there are sublimits that may be applied to different areas. Be aware of those. Incident costs, as I say, first party, third party, e-crime. Be cognizant of the limits and sublimits that may be applied to a given area of coverage. But to the point of litigation, yes, absolutely covered. Fines and penalties, GDPR, CCPA, all of those factor in. I will say, the more records you have that may have been exfiltrated, PII, in the case of hospitals, PHI, anyone handling financials, PCI, that can be costly. You want to make sure that your limits account for the true exposure you face.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing is that it doesn't stop post incident or post breach. You know, have a post-mortem and figure out what went right and what went wrong. And if something went right, great, double down. If something went wrong, what can we do to make sure it never happens again, or set ourselves up so that it's least likely to happen again? There's always attacks, right? But you can do a lot to make sure that those are reduced significantly. So, you know, we're heading into the last 15 minutes here. And what I would say is, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and drop those in the Q&A. The chat is closed, but drop them in the Q&A and we'll start looking, you know, at those. And I just want to get some final thoughts from all of us. So Diana, any final thoughts?
Well, I know that Tim may have to jump a little bit early, so I wanted to pose a couple of these quick questions in the Q&A to him, and then I'll give you my final thoughts. But Tim, one of the questions was, you know, a software platform question about like shared collaborative documents. You know, is there a specific service that you recommend? You know, I mentioned Google Docs, which I hate, but are there collaboration documents that are safer than others, or is it a matter of the controls that you set on them? Do you have any suggestions there from your IT background on what you would recommend to a client to use?
Spot on. It all boils down to the controls you use. So old military days, worked in the classified world for many years. It should be based upon a need to know. It's harder to manage, but being granular like that, enforcing a policy of those who should and should not have access, that's the way to do it up front. Second, I personally love cloud-based solutions, but you have to manage them. I love applications that track. You want to be sure to track who has access, when, where, and why. And that goes down and boils down to the security side of it. If there's an issue, data loss, who did it, where did it go? You want to make sure you do that. I would say that an access management solution where you manage your users by group and individually is the best tack to take, whatever platform you use. I will finish with one comment, and that is be brilliant at the basics. There are best practices that everyone should be employing. Do them well. Do not overlook them. I can say that your broker should be helping you with that on the cyber side. We do that at MMA. That is my role. I help define what those best practices are as part of our Cyber Center of Excellence. We use those based upon what the insurers expect of you as an insured. They know the vectors of attack. They do forensics all the time. I work with them. Your broker should do the same for you, walk you through those best practices, ensure that you have them employed. I will say that having someone on your side in a broker who loves what they do, I love what I do. I'm a former IT professional, supporting the cyber side. I hate the bad guys. I want to see us win. I guess final thought, just be brilliant at the basics.
I am
Okay.
muted. Look at that. There, it looks like there's a question to you, Tim, here, which is when talking about specific insurance to recommend we have coverage, what would be a company recommendation?
Okay, so I can say you probably don't go directly to an insurer. Your broker should handle that, and then they will have access to a huge market behind them. I have access because of what I do to all of them, from the US all the way to Lloyd's. Either directly or indirectly, we find the best policy coverage and terms regardless of who the insurer is. It may be Beasley, it may be Travelers, it may be Chubb. There are many out there to choose from. The most important angle is how well do they handle claims if they occur. There are some markets that are absolutely fantastic in that regard. But the first thing, want to make sure that your policy coverage matches the exposures you face.
I think that's a really important part. I think you really have to look inward and say, what's the kind of data that we collect, we as a law firm are collecting? You know, is it sensitive? Is it sexy? Is it something that has value to other people? You know, like we talked about at the beginning, to mention, you know, M&A deals, huge value. Insider information that could affect markets, absolutely huge value. And you might not think that's as sexy as, you know, somebody's nude photos, but it's really, really valuable. And that may not be something that somebody posts online. They want to keep that information for themselves to make themselves a lot of money. So you really have to look at that and talk it through with your broker to find the right policy for you. There's no one size fits all. There's no one, you know, insurance company that's better than all others. It depends on your needs and really looking at that. There's another question here. Yeah, there's another question here that I don't have the answer to. It's a question about banks' liability for stolen funds by a hacker through ACH. I will say there was just a recent article about Zelle transfers, which all of the banks are using, and being very, very difficult to get that money back if you've been hacked or if somebody's taken out under some sort of false pretenses. When you are authorizing the transaction, it is often very, very difficult to then say, oops, I did that on accident. And so, you know, you really have to figure out whether you want those new super convenient technologies. If it's somebody you don't know or an account you've never given to before, you should really pick up the phone and do some due diligence before you do it. I don't know the answer to that particular question. I don't know if Tim or Heather do on the specifics about bank transfers, but I will say, talk to your bank and really look at it, because different transactions are handled differently or approached differently.
Yeah, the most common thing I see actually more that for business clients more than anyone else is business wire fraud, which is you think you're sending it to a company you may have worked with for 5, 10, 20 years. But what has happened is they're so sophisticated in these schemes that it's insane to actually look at after the fact, because sometimes I have to look at it 2-3 times to say, wait, what did go wrong here? Because they will buy domains that are nearly identical to everyone's, right? So the service provider who, you know, is working for the business, and then they'll link it all together. And if you send money to the wrong person, in that case, the bank is not going to be able to do anything from a business account. Business accounts are just not protected the same way.
But insurance can cover that. So that can fall under e-crime.
Yeah.
So you want to have a callback provision if you know that there's a change of person to send to. But if it is something, to Heather's point, that looks legit, you thought it was accurate, it can be insured. E-crime.
Good.
Make
good
sure it's
point.
in your policy.
Really good point.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so I'll jump into my takeaways, which are just, you know, you have to raise awareness within your company, within your firm about cybersecurity. You know, really getting the buy-in from the folks at the top to understand that this is a priority. This is happening. to companies every day, companies just like yours, no matter how small you think you are, you know, even if you're a solo practitioner, there is value to your data. And it could just be the value of locking you up and having you pay $25,000 in crypto. You know, that's $25,000 that hacker wouldn't have had without your data. So, you know, really think about how to manage the process. You know, are there third-party products or vendors that you need to get involved in your business, you know, to monitor? Are you doing testing? Have you trained your employees? Because a huge part of the types of incursions that we see is based on human error, right? It's not somebody who's wearing a dark hat and going in and really wreaking havoc just for no reason. It's somebody who found a vulnerability in your front line and exploited it. So training your employees at all levels, even the managing partner, all the way down to any of your support staff that have access to that data is really important. And really making this an annual thing that you look at and you test and you train on cybersecurity and then on privacy issues as well. Heather, what are your takeaways?
So my final thought is kind of a related but adjunct thought, which is when we're dealing with cybersecurity, it's so important, but it has this sibling, which is privacy. And I always want people to never forget the privacy aspect, which is privacy laws and regulations are so important. And the foundation for all of it is know what data you're collecting, know where it lives. And that ties right into everything cybersecurity related. Because while, you know, we've mentioned this a couple of times now, if you don't know where your data is and something happens, it's going to be so much worse. So don't forget privacy on a basic level. And then also because it's really important because there's a lot of laws that regulate privacy, which would be a whole separate program. But yes, that's generally my takeaway is never forget the privacy law side of this as well.
Great tip.
Let's see here. So we have another question here, which is, our clients, colleagues, and even adverse parties want to prevent document version forking and eliminate the nonstop volley of email red lines, don't we all? By having everyone comment.
Heather, I think that was the one we addressed.
Oh, you
Jim
did?
talked about that, which is about, you know, the user controls that you can control. Well, who has access? You know, if it's invitation only and it only goes to a specific email address, and you know what? If they want their secretary or assistant to use it, you've got to get that person's email address so that they can be invited. Also setting a document access period, making it only accessible for a week or a couple of days while you're getting a deal done, or really just making sure, like Tim said, that you have some sort of tracking information that's logged there so you can see who did what and when they did it.
Access control. Yep.
So Heather, are there any further questions in the Q&A?
What would you recommend with court reporters asking for Zelle payments for transcripts?
I would say no. I would say, you know, are they sending you an invoice? If so, I assume that invoice has a remittance address. And I know that checks still work, although there's, you know, issues with checks as well. But I think Zelle makes it very difficult. One, if you send it to the wrong person, or if you send it to the court reporter and not the company that they're contracting with, there's a lot of potential liability there. So, you know, pay your invoices that come in as invoices, not a verbal request. Here's my Zelle, can you pay me? Because also for, you know, for a court reporter who may be an independent contractor, you know, if they're getting a payment personally versus to their business or having a business account, there are different implications. I just wouldn't want to be part of that, paying somebody personally as opposed to through their business. So I would proceed with caution. I'm not saying that there's no situations where it might make sense. It may be a business account, but sometimes I go back to the basics. Sometimes I go back to the old school ways of doing things and writing checks or sending it to the address that's on, you know, an actual invoice and to the person it's supposed to be paid to. Because there's just so much room these days. And when we're not having face-to-face transactions and we're not always knowing who we're dealing with, I think it's important to do your due diligence on those types of things.
So I think we've come to the end of our time here. I want to thank Diana, Heather, and Tim for giving us this presentation today. I think everybody who attended, has got some really great takeaways based on our three esteemed leaders here advice. And Tim, I'd like to thank your company, MMA, Marsh McLennan Agency, for sponsoring this presentation. And again, both Heather and Diana are, business friends of mine, and I want to thank you too for being here today and putting in the time. And I believe that what's ever left in the Q&A queue, maybe Heather, you can spread that out to the two other presenters to maybe provide answers via email if that's possible. I don't know.
Sure. I don't think there's anything left, actually.
Oh, okay, wonderful. So we got all the questions answered, which is unusual. But again, I'd like to thank all the attendees for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at our next presentation. Thank you.